Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our first Power Chat of 2021. We're so lucky, grateful to have Christian Wolff joining us to chat for the next 30 minutes. Christian, thank you for taking some time to hang out with us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
I wanted to start off by asking you about the piece that you wrote for Loadbang. It's called Just So You'll Know, and it has texts by John Ashbery. In fact, it's the dedication is in memory of John Ashbery. I just wanted to ask you how you came to use these texts for the piece and your connection to Ashbery.
Yeah, well, it's the third set of texts that I've used that I've made music to of Ashbery's. Um, I I discovered his poetry relatively late. I don't know when. Late now for me is like 20 years ago, recently. Anyway, and uh, and then we got to work together and got to be friends, and that was very nice. And then when we first met, he said, I we could have met like, I don't know, 50 years ago. It was in 1952, New Year's Day. It was a famous concert in New York, which it was Martin Feldman's idea to do it on the 1st of January because nobody knows what to do on New Year's Day. They've celebrated the night before, they've slept it off, but what do you do with the rest of the next day? So he said, let's do a concert. And this was David Tudor was available. So he did this amazing concert with, I think, the premiere of John Cage's Music of Changes and the Boulez Second Piano Sonata and shorter pieces of Feldman's and mine. And Ashbery was at that concert. We could have met, but didn't. I mean, I was 17 years old, so it was, and he was already, he wasn't actually particularly famous then, but he was getting going. So that's my connection to Ashbery over the years. I mean, there's a big gap. And then, as I say, about maybe 15 years ago now, whatever, we met because somebody in the Swedish radio had a program combining poetry and music, and they thought up this notion of having us do something together, and which was great because we got a chance to meet. As I say, we became friends and so forth. Yeah.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you so much. It's so nice to think about, connections across our lives with these wonderful artists, and that you could come back around after what seems like it's a missed opportunity or something. Is like then you get to have this wonderful collaboration. And
yeah, no, I was very happy that worked out. Yeah.
What is it, if you could put your finger on it, that draws you to Ashbery's writing in terms of like wanting to set it?
That's a good question. I don't understand the poetry. I bet you not a whole lot of people do. On the other hand, it's incredibly readable. And it has this weird combination of sounding as though it's making perfectly good sense. But if you stop and say, well, what is he saying here? You can't explain it. And that combination, because the language is perfectly ordinary. It's not fancy or, unduly. Actually, it's a mix of all kinds of things, but it's very accessible. So any given line or sentence makes perfectly good sense, but then suddenly you shift gears and you have no idea where are we now, and somehow I like that. and it's in some ways it's also easier to make music for that because you don't have to worry too much about what's he actually saying. You don't have to, because you don't know what he's saying. You just go ahead and make the music as best you can with the words that you have at your disposal.
That's interesting. I think about it kind of, it's very musical writing in that like there's a bunch of information, but what it's signifying is not really all that clear. You can tell there's something there, but it's not narrative. It's really because I think we've had two big pieces now, yours and Charles Warrenen's, that are Ashbery settings, and your music is very, very different, but there's something like there's some connective tissue in terms of that. I think that's really fascinating. I was going to ask you, in the piece for us, but also a lot of the other music of yours that I've played or coached or we've all played, there's quite a bit of openness in terms of giving agency and permission to the performers to do quite a bit with it. But that being said, I feel like it's certainly possible to do it wrong. Like you could play your music wrong in the same way, like I think about Cage's music. It's very open, but you can screw it up. I wonder how you think, how you sort of philosophically navigate and negotiate between this idea of communicating enough information that you're getting your piece and a correct performance while also leaving the amount of space that you do for our agency to make decisions.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I don't think, in some ways, I don't even know exactly. When I'm, and there are pieces, I mean, some of my pieces are relatively mostly there. The notes are all there. It's more in those pieces, and I think the one for Loadbang is fairly close to that mode. It's relatively clear what the music is there. It looks initially like a fairly conventional score. On the other hand, well, the model, if you will, that I have for that is earlier music. If you go look at unedited editions of, starting already, more or less with already going back no further than Mozart. The other day I was looking at some Mozart piano sonatas, and there's hardly any, there are no phrasings, there are hardly any dynamics. There's a tempo, there's, you could do it any number, in a wide variety of different ways. And then when you get earlier music, say Bach or whatever, it's wide open. I mean, you can, if you listen to recordings of people playing this music, they do quite different ways of doing the same. So I think of myself as, I've pushed that idea, but the notion that the music is one thing and the performance is something else actually has a very long tradition. It's only in the 19th century, actually with Beethoven probably starting, where people got much more particular, specific about what they wanted the player to do. And then finally in the 50s, it got ridiculous because sort of every note had some special little marking and a different dynamic and all the rest of it. And partly, I suppose you might say I'm partly in reaction to that because I thought that was ridiculous. So, but I went a little bit further, a little bit far in the other direction some of the time, yeah. It's one more thing. When the pieces are very open, I mean, I've had a lot of experience now, and I've had some terrible, I mean, pieces have been destroyed by people, no question. And usually if something's going badly in a rehearsal, the first thing I do is ask the player, what is he doing? Show me in the score what it is you're playing. And usually I discover that there's some misunderstanding of the score, or the players just decided to do whatever, not with any relationship to what's actually on the score. So it's a matter of using my scores, even when they're open, in the way you use any score, which is you pay attention to what is specified. So on the other hand, the other thing I do sometimes is, if it's very open, I try to think of what's the worst possible thing that could happen, given the choices that I've given people. And if it's okay, if I can live with that, then I'll let it go. Okay, I'll leave it the way it is. Which isn't to say somebody could think of something that even I hadn't thought of that I would find totally unacceptable. It's just, you take your chances, I guess. Yeah.
So Christian, you kind of came up in New York around so many great influences, John Cage, Morton Feldman, David Tudor, Ashbery, etc. And at that time, there was like a lot of stylistic clashing between kind of their more open style of composition and the style you just referenced, where like every note has its own specific marking, kind of that like post-serialist generation. When you started composing, did you find yourself coming from one school or going from one school to another with your influences? I'm kind of curious, being surrounded by so many great artists, where, like, yeah.
Well, when I started, I didn't know about that European music. The only thing I knew was Webern and Schoenberg and Baird and Bartók. I mean, and Stravinsky. I mean, that was sort of my knowledge of 20th century music. I knew scores. I'd seen scores of Ives, I'd seen scores of Cage, but I never heard any of that. So basically I was starting, and then I thought I would like to do something which wasn't like anybody else, because why do what somebody else is doing? I mean, it's pointless. So I just took off and did what in those early pieces, I don't know where the hell they came from. I mean, they're the ones with just a few notes, like a violin duo on 3 pitches, 3 adjacent D, E flat, and E for 6 minutes. I mean, come on. Anyway, so I started just totally out of nowhere in that area. And then in the earlier 50s, we then got to know about Stockhouse and Boulez, and that music impressed us a lot. And I think that's where the idea of making much more complex music and so forth came about. And so those were some influences. Not that the music, not that I wrote in the same, using these techniques, but the idea of, say, especially writing complex music. And that was partly David Tudor, because this guy could play anything. And in fact, the more difficult it was, the better he liked it. So, you know, you kind of did your best to give him something really hard to do. Yeah.
Do you find that there's, you know, I was actually just listening to that violin duo the other day and sort of marveling at its strangeness. Do you feel like do you feel connections or like a through line back to those earliest pieces, or do those feel like someone else artistically?
Yeah, no, I think there's still, what's nice about the duo, I mean, that piece is now what, it's 70 years old, which is like, it blows my mind. But I still like the piece, and people still seem to like to play it, and it still works, which amazes me after all this time. It's very encouraging. I don't try to redo them. I mean, there's no point to doing that. It's true that recently I'm trying to clean up my stuff, and I found another of those pieces with very few notes in that I'd totally forgotten about. It has a trombone in it, by the way. I forget. I think clarinet, trombone, and violin, or something weird like. Anyway, I've recently been making an orchestra. It's actually a piano. No, what is it? It's the violin concerto. And suddenly, for some reason, since I've just picked up this piece, I stick it right in there. The orchestra's going, and the violinist is going. And suddenly, there's this trio on 3 notes, just in the middle of the orchestra section. And it's not. I break it up. It goes on for maybe 10 bars, and then there's something else happens, and then it comes back. So in that sense, and it will feel very different, obviously. And now people won't think that. I mean, when that earlier piece was first played, people thought I was out of my mind. I mean, they said, "That's not music. What are you doing?" So, and now, of course, no problem. It's just one more thing in the whole sort of collection of musical things that are out there. So yes, partly I do have that. It hasn't gone away. But on the other hand, I don't want to. I've done it. I don't need to do it anymore. In fact, I only did it for about maybe at most 2 years at the time, and then I moved on. I went to Boulez. I've had an extraordinary, lucky life. When I graduated from high school, my parents took me to Europe. They had stuff to do there too. So, and we were in Paris. And Cage had told me I really had to look up this really interesting French composer called Pierre Boulez. I mean, at the time he was unknown. And so I did. And we had a very nice time. We showed each other scores and stuff like that. And when he saw this piece with only 3 notes, he says, "Well, why do you use so few notes?" And I don't know if I didn't really explain myself. But then I went home again. And then within a year, I wrote another piano piece, which uses all 88 notes of the keyboard. Just to show him I can do that too, if you want.
I wonder, so this is maybe a little bit too specific, but one of the pieces of notation of yours that I think is really fantastic and really communicative is this breath mark.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Because it communicates something very different from the comma.
Right.
And I wonder when and why did that sort of work its way? When did you become unsatisfied with the comma?
Right. Okay. I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember. It's probably a set of pieces called exercises. There's a whole bunch of them, but the first set is 1 through 14. And those are basically on one stave. Sometimes they're 2 voices, but often just one. And the music is available to anybody who can play. And to accommodate ranges of different instruments, you can read either treble or bass clef. So there are already a number of open things. On the other hand, the music is quite melodic. It's very accessible. But somehow the way it got written, I wanted these spaces between the phrases, which would be open. So they could be a comma, which is usually relatively short, or they could be quite long. And that's what the wedge, I call it a wedge, is about. It's the interesting thing about it for me is that it could be anything. It could be like barely a breath, or it could be somebody could just sit there for 10 seconds and do nothing, and see what happens. And usually it's used with other instruments. So partly your decisions are dependent on what is going on around you. If you're doing it musically at all, you can't help but react to the whole sonic space, so to speak. So if it's been very busy, you decide, well, maybe it's time for a little quiet. So you don't play. And maybe the other people will catch on and don't play, or maybe not, and then you carry on.
That's cool. I enjoy that, and I enjoy also teaching it to students. It takes them a little bit like, wait, what do you mean I can do kind of whatever I want? Like, but what's right and what's wrong is always a fun sort of a fun conversation to have. I wonder, so you've been living in Vermont for quite a long time, right?
Yep.
Did you was that a conscious decision? Were you in New York and it was sort of time to get out?
No, it's all practical. I started in New York and I really liked it a lot there, but then I went to school up in Cambridge, Mass. And then I got a job at Dartmouth in Hanover, New Hampshire. And as it happened, I met my wife-to-be down in Cambridge, and her father was at the time teaching at Dartmouth, and she actually really wanted to leave her family situation, get out of Hanover's small town, get into the real world. So what do? We got married, but we've stayed in Cambridge for a few more years, but then I took her right back again to where she came from. Anyway, her parents at that time, by then her father had retired, and he had this farm up in Vermont, excuse me, and so they retired to the farm. And then when they passed away, we inherited the farm, and that's where we've been living on and off. We still have a house in Hanover, so I go back. My music stuff is all mostly in Hanover. That's sort of, there's so much junk there that I can't. There's no room for it up here. So I go back and forth, but basically I think of myself as located in Vermont. Yeah.
Do you think that that sort of being removed from a place like New York or from a place like Boston and being closer to the natural world influences your musical work?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's not a conscious thing. I mean, you walk in the woods and you see things, you see patterns, you see things you don't see in this. Well, you can go to Central Park if you want to see nature. So but on the other hand, it's pretty, it's all over, it's everywhere. And then the sounds are great here. My favorite sounds are in the spring when the frogs start acting up. So you get the frog noises coming from the pond, and then the most beautiful sound of all are the peepers, which are these tiny little frog-like creatures that they come in thousands of them. And it's like Steve Reich gone crazy. It's just this amazing saturated sound of these, and they all have different pitches. So it's like a huge cluster. So stuff like that. Not that I try to do that musically myself, but I certainly enjoy it. And in some way, it has to have some effect on what I'm doing. Yeah.
I'm really curious. You've talked about a few different approaches and influences of sounds and patterns and limited pitch sets and proving something to Boulez about using all the notes in the keyboard. When you compose, do you think of systems, or do you go intuitively once you put pen to paper, or is it some combination of those? I'm really curious what your approach is. Does it change?
It has changed quite a lot. My earlier pieces were often quite elaborately structured. And they were based, the structure was based not so much on pitch as on time lengths. They derived the Cage's notion of the, what does he call it? Can't remember the name of it now. But it's where he uses proportions to determine the subdivisions of a piece. So if a piece is, say, so many minutes long, he figures out, he may start the piece and then find that a given phrase runs, say, 2 measures, 3 measures, 5 measures, 2, 3, 5, okay? And then he'll do that twice, and then he'll do it 3 times, and then you do it 5 times, okay? And each of those larger subdivisions will be characterized in some way that's different from the other ones, but within each of them, he also has to make some distinctions between the 2, 3, and 5 phrases, okay? So it's very elegant because it means that the larger structure is a reflection of the smaller. The smaller structure it has its proportions are the same, the small and the large. It's a very elegant idea. You don't hear it, but it somehow gives the structure kind of coherence that you somehow feel. So I worked with that quite a lot. And then I think at some point I thought, okay, I don't need to do that anymore. I just go ahead. And then so each piece then has its own procedures. The exercises that I mentioned earlier, I start, actually, this is kind of funny. They're a response to minimalism. I enjoyed the early Philip Glass and Steve Reich a lot. I mean, that was just kind of, partly because it came after the super complicated uptown music that you got. And suddenly we got modal, we got a rhythm, we got, all these things that we hadn't had for a while, and they sounded great. Just, so I thought, well, maybe I'd like to do, that's probably one source of what I do is a response to other music. And in this case, it was to the minimalists. But I wasn't going to, again, I wasn't going to make no point doing that, what they're doing. So I made these exercises, which are very simple and which often are modal in pitch. The rhythm, the pulse beat is not there, especially with the wedges in between phrases. That makes it almost impossible to maintain a steady beat. But somehow the melodic thing, and they're also, I think, listening, they're very accessible. They're not like some of my earlier music and all of that 50s music and so forth. So that's one change. And there have been various others. And recently, which is easy, because that's what I remember best, because I'm doing right now, is there are systems, but they're all sort of micro systems. I mean, I'll do something for like 3 bars, and then it's enough. Next. So if there's any larger principle, it's discontinuity. That I just go from one thing, jump to the next, and don't worry what I've left, how to get to the next thing or how I got there or anything like that. I just, I had this composition students often, it's one for some reason I remember, this kid was really hung up about a transition. He had this thing and then he wanted to get to here and he didn't know how to make the transition. I just told him, forget about the transition, just go to the next thing. And that's sort of what I do. And as I said, within each of these, there's usually some compositional idea. And then I do have some fairly consistent ones which have to do with pitches. Pitches are a real pain in the neck. They're so difficult to decide. I mean, if you're not writing tonal music, if you're not writing serial music, how the hell do you choose your pitch? It's really difficult. So what I do is a kind of, I'll start with maybe just a gesture of my own. That's, you might say, just inspiration, whatever you call it. Or just as frequently, I'll use something else. I'll use the opening notes of some Bach piece or a folk song or whatever. And then I do transpositions, and they're actually they're 12 tone. Like first note, I'll say a series of 5 in a phrase that comes from somewhere. First note will go up or down a half tone, and the next one will go up or down a whole tone, and then up or down a minor third, major third, all the way till I get the tritone. Then I go backwards back to the. The important point is that it's not it's a fluid transposition, because going up or down makes a huge difference if you think of the melodic line. So it's binary choices all the time, and they give me just enough freedom to make a melodic line. On the other hand, there's enough constraint to help me work. I mean, I find without having some kind of structure, it's really hard to just write. I can't do it. Then I want to improvise. That's a whole other story. Yeah.
Christian, I wanted to ask you briefly. We have like about 5 minutes till the end. If you could tell us about what were some of the biggest challenges you faced artistically last year, and what do you have coming up in the new year? What are some of your ongoing projects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I can't be anywhere. You can't travel. And I mean, I've already had 5 cancellations last year of, new pieces, premieres, whatever. So that's really the main problem. On the other hand, because there's nothing else to do, I got a huge amount of work. I've written 6 pieces this year, 2 concertos, 2 sets of songs, a set of piano, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, it's sort of, you're writing into the blue. And one of the pieces is going to be done, and that will be streamed, but I won't get to go. It's in Switzerland. I won't get to go and won't be in on the rehearsals. So all of that process of putting a piece together with other people, that's gone for the moment. And that's hard. That's quite hard. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if that, as I say, the plus side is that there's nothing else to do but work.
Yeah, I know it seems like there's quite a bit of variety with how people have responded. Like I know, especially towards the beginning, there seemed to be a lot of people feeling like this is great. There's so much time. You can do so much work. I mean, great, hardly great, but the reason why there's so much time. But then it felt like maybe a few months into it, it sort of turned and people felt that they weren't really able to work in that same way. But I am encouraged by the fact that you were able to like not only be productive, but to be like kind of uber productive, I think is amazing.
Yeah, well, as I say, I mean, I really feel sorry for you guys. I mean, because you can't play properly, right? You have to do all these Zooming things and so on, which I frankly I really don't like much. And it's just not the real thing. And yeah, no, all my musician friends, all my performing friends, they're all kind of, they're just waiting and hoping and waiting and hoping and doing the occasional Zoom thing, which is often lovely, but it's not what they should be doing.
Right.
Yeah.
You touched on it very quickly before we were just talking now about improvisation. Do you do that quite a bit on your own, or how does that sort of fit into your musical life?
I find it impossible to improvise on my own. I never do solo. I always have to have at least one other person. Yeah, but I've been doing it for a long time now. I originally must have been in the 70s, I can't remember. But anyway, it was with the Cornelius Cardew group, AMM. It's one of the first free improv groups. I happened to be in London for a year on a sabbatical when they'd been going for about a year, and I got to hear them, and I really liked what they were doing, and then I got to play with them, and that was a total trip. I mean, that was really great. And then that got me started, and I've been doing it whenever I can ever since.
Do you ever use it? Do you ever use it compositionally, like as a sort of tool?
Not quite. I did not. The only time I have used it, pure improvisation, is it's a couple of years ago now. It's a concerto for two percussionists, one of whom was Robin Shulkovsky, and the other one is Joey Barron, who basically is an improvising musician. However, we'd worked together before, and I knew pretty much what he could do with notation. But there are stretches in that piece where I just say that the soloist can just improvise. The orchestra is doing its thing, and they kind of do what they want to do in that context. So that's with people who are, in one case, just total professional improviser, Joey, and Robin does a lot of improvising too. So it seemed logical. But most of the musicians I work with, I may be wrong about this, but don't do a whole lot of improvising. And if they do, they should just do it. I don't want to get involved. I mean, they should just do it. I don't need to be involved in that.
That's really fun. Well, Christian, thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with us and to share a bit about you and your process. It's great to see you also. Hopefully the next time we will be in person somewhere, but in the meantime, this does the trick.
Okay, good. So good luck to everybody. Yeah, and let's hope things start to normalize a little bit more.
Yeah, seems like maybe we're getting there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for viewing. Our next one's coming up will be with Evan Johnson and with Scott Wolschlager, so please stay tuned. Thank you again for hanging out with us tonight, and we will see you soon.
Okay. All right.